Hey, good morning, Drive Time. Welcome back. As always, I'm David Drum, and today I am joined by the one and only Pastor Joseph Gilchrist. Now, he's going to be hard to see. He's in camouflage today, but, I'm sure you'll be able to follow him a little bit. Just squint, look at the screen. So, Joseph, welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Sorry about the camouflage. Hopefully you keep up.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, give the guys a little peek behind the screen here is you and I have struggled to get our calendars to align a couple of times to make these recordings happen. But you are, I think this is your third time on Drive Time, would put you in the top 2% of our speakers.
All right, let's go.
So for as much work as it's been for us to make today happen, you're still I would call you a regular on Drive Time.
Yeah. So like one of the top tier. You could almost sound like the Jim Harbaugh of Drive Time.
Oh man, does that mean you're going to screw this up right at the end?
Maybe last year, but not this year.
Oh, fair enough. All right. So I know we're going to talk about something totally different and unique today. We are going to talk about Jesus. So you just spoke just a week or so ago about this topic of Jesus and his manhood. But as is typically the case, when you guys are stringing together messages and series, there's a lot left on the cutting room floor, so to speak, of information that you guys just don't get to talk about because there's just not enough time. And there's a lot of different directions you guys can go. So you are here today to kind of get back into a little bit of your message. And guys, Joseph's message, the link to it will be in the description of this video. So if you didn't get a chance to see it in church, go back and watch it because there's going to be some of the context for today.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head with the idea of, definitely can't fit, I think, any content fully. There's so many complexities and nuances to anything you're going to talk about in a 25 to 30 minute message. But I think especially when you talk about the life of Jesus and really what he meant and what he's meant to the world, but also just in so many different lenses. Again, I think you can attack it from so many different backgrounds. You could look at, him through the lens of scripture, him through the lens of the impact he left on the world. You could look at him through the lens of history, just a historical perspective. There's a lot of different ways to kind of slice and dice up, who Jesus was, what he was meant. And that's actually one of my favorite things to do. And sometimes within the evangelical church, I think it can get you in trouble. But one of my favorite things is to look at Jesus through a historical perspective. And what that means is actually, just for argument's sake, don't lose me here, but just for argument's sake, you remove the deity for a second, right? And you look through the pages and you look through the story and the context of history and go, so who was this guy? Just like you look at Aristotle or you'd look at Julius Caesar and go, well, who were they and what was the mark they left? And why that is so fascinating to me is because if most historical perspectives you look at, whether it's Aristotle, right? You have this beautiful scientific mind. And the reason he comes to the forefront and why we want to discuss and talk about his life is because of really what he added to the conversation within science and how brilliant he was, and the things that he brought to the forefront within that field. You could talk about Julius Caesar and you think through, right, like his overall governing rule and that he basically conquered the whole world at the time. Most of the known world was under his command. And so, wow, what a ruler in his, time and day. But then you get to this guy, Jesus, and, who is he?
Right. And I've heard atheists who have studied the life of Jesus to understand, like, okay, their express statement is they don't believe that he's the Son of God. They don't believe he's he's not a prophet. He's not anything. They don't believe in the spiritual side at all. That's them. But they are still blown away by the impact of a single man, not in royalty, not in governmental leadership. So like you're talking about there, even if you take that side out of it, I mean, for me, that's what explains it. Why else would we still be following and studying a man over 2,000 years later? But it's just that thought of like, even the most, adamant agnostic or atheist perspective can recognize, man, this dude did something to our culture.
Right. And if you drill that down just a little bit deeper, because that is just about everybody acknowledges this is a real man. He's a real man in history since 2,000 years ago. He walked the earth, whether they believe he died and resurrected or whatever, but they believe he was a man. And that's so fascinating too. You got just about everybody in the world go, okay, this guy. But again, the importance of he's not royalty. He's not a brilliant scientist. He's not like, what did he add? And when you ask the question, what was he? You get down to he was a Jewish carpenter from Nazareth. And so his name, again, starting to debunk some of these things, his name, as he would have been called, is Yeshua, which is at that point in time in Jewish tradition, probably more likely translated to like Joshua. But we get Jesus from actually Paul breaks it into Greek as Jesus, and then in Latin turns to Jesus, and then in our English vernacular now it's Jesus, right? So that's kind of the train. But Yeshua, a Jewish carpenter from Nazareth, not just Middle East, from Nazareth, which was like the lowest of the low within them. It's like, I was joking with somebody earlier, it's like Immokalee in Florida. And if you don't know where that is, that's kind of the point. It's like, well, who knows? It's a little tiny town within the Everglades. Like nothing good. Like what comes out of that? It's the Everglades. People don't even know it exists. And so when you get that and you go, okay, on top of that, he only lived till he was 33. So he only had a short time in his life to really make a mark and then to move forward within the lens of history and go, all types of things are pointed back to him from orphanages. That's a Jesus following individual that starts the first ever orphanage. Hospitals, Jesus following individual starts the first active hospital. You can track back so many institutions back to Jesus following people that are meant to do better for and really have goodwill toward humankind on this earth. And it points back to a Jewish carpenter from Nazareth. Like it doesn't compute. It doesn't really make sense. And when you read it, and that's what I love, like when you read it, even when you remove, for argument's sake, let's remove the deity concept and just look at him as through the historical lens as a man, a lot of that power is still there. Like a lot of it still exists. And if you could compile that and rattle it off, one of my sources actually that I referenced even on the, is Who Is This Man by John Ortberg. I referenced that during my message as well. But when you rattle that off and you kind of compile this just from a historical perspective, it's wildly powerful.
So, all right. So if we, again, talking about boiling it down to his contributions as a man, I mean, you and I would probably agree that the reason he had the wisdom he had and the ability to influence the way he did was because of the spiritual component that obviously existed there that you and I would believe and follow. But as a man, you talked about these institutions that were created by his followers, orphanages, really, you can't even have conversations about civil rights, equal rights, women's rights without a Christian component to it, because he was really the first one saying, like, no, we're all actually equal, right?
Yeah, I think, you see those reference throughout his life. He modeled it maybe even more than he would overtly always state it, but clearly modeled the ability from the woman at the well, that situation in context, the Samaritan woman at the well, for him to sit down with her, to have a conversation with her, to send her out into the village. And then, I reference this almost all the time. I love the fact that in scripture, by the end of that chapter, it says the woman is the reason why the whole town was saved. Like that's an iconic, tipping point for women within that culture that never would have been stated, let alone a Jewish man talking to a Samaritan woman. And I mean, it says so. The disciples showed up and they were in shock, basically in awe, probably some horror, that our Jewish rabbi was talking with a Samaritan woman, both based on race and gender within that situation. They're like, whoa, breaking all these rules. But he consistently did that for the down and out, consistently did that for the marginalized, for the oppressed, for the people who were looked at as less than equal. And then that causes Paul, later on to go neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, neither Greek, neither Hebrew, like they're all equal. Like that is the cause. And so that's kind of trumpeted throughout. And again, that's all apart from death and resurrection. That's Paul looking at the life story of Jesus and going, whoa, if he's doing what I think he's doing and saying what I think he's saying. I love that about the early Christians too. They started this thing when Christians were first created. They weren't called Christians. They called themselves followers of the way. I think we've kind of lost that to an extent within our culture. Like, well, I'm following a new way. I'm following the way. It's a different way than what's constructed within politics, and it's a different way than what's constructed within religion. It's this new vein, and I'm treating everybody, as different but equal. And Jesus spurred that on.
So, all right. Now you mentioned this is kind of the historical lens, but you also said there are other ways to view Jesus in those exact same situations. There's other lenses to look at him. What are some of those other lenses?
Yeah, I think obviously through the lens of scripture, right? So when I talk about through the lens of scripture, I'm talking about from a 30,000 foot view. So I love kind of taking people on this journey because I think sometimes we can get just zeroed in on a specific piece of scripture, and we can kind of get stuck there. But Scott McKnight, who's theologian and professor, wrote a book called Blue Parakeet, and he kind of writes out about the idea within the Bible. It wasn't really put together as we chunked it into scriptures and verses and made it small and minute details, but it was actually written as full books, each one just a full book. And then the whole thing was compiled, 40 different books, 66 different books, 40 different authors as a story. And so we are supposed to really read scripture as a whole story. And when you break it out as a whole story, you have this beautiful picture of really the whole Old Testament really leading up to Jesus arriving. And really the biggest synopsis we're really supposed to take away from it is we can take away all these other subpoints and things, and that's cool and that's important. And you can form your own doctrine and theology in a bunch of different ways. But the biggest takeaway is really we were screwed up. Like it was really disjointed when Jesus arrived. Like we were far off the path, and you could take that in 100 million different directions, but we were not. We were missing the mark in a major way. And then Jesus arrives and basically is the picture of what you've heard, and he references it. This is what you heard, or this is what you say. The law says it this way, but I say the law says this, but I say the law says this, but in the kingdom it is this. And really describes to us a revelation of who God is. He is the revelation of who God is to us, the closest revelation we'll ever get. And then really reveals to us a new way of doing life, and starts to tell us. I love Jesus too, because there's not even as much demand in Jesus's tone again, that's countercultural to a lot of preachers that might get up on stage and we may demand, this is what God demands or decrees. Jesus did a lot more of blessed is the peacemaker. Blessed are you if you, there's a lot of just, hey, and you almost, once you start to look at it through this lens, you start to realize, oh, he's really just laying out, hey, this is the typical stream of life. This is the way it's running. And if you could get on it this way, it won't have to feel like so much work and so much effort and so much tiresome. You don't have to run this rat race the same way everybody else is doing it. You could move this direction. It doesn't mean obstacles won't come. It doesn't mean there won't be, rocks in the way at times or things on the stream bed. But at the end of the day, he depicts to us, again, even within the 30,000 foot view of Scripture. Now that works moving. Anyway, I've heard theologians even say to the extent of, if you're looking at something in the Old Testament and it doesn't make sense, or it doesn't seem like, or it's confusing, how does this there and that's there, and it almost seems like God's committing genocide here and he's doing this crazy thing over here. What's going on? We aren't meant to just pick apart the Old Testament. We actually zoom straight to Jesus and go, does it make sense in the nature of Jesus's life? And if it doesn't, then I look backwards through the rest of Scripture, through the lens of Jesus, through Scripture. Now Scripture is being decided based on what Jesus did and how he lived life. And I look back through it and I go, and I'm missing something here. I'm pulling something out of context. I don't understand the world. I don't understand the words. There's something missing. I'm not exegeting correctly, because if Jesus didn't line this up as well, then it's not the illustration I'm supposed to be getting, or the characteristic I'm supposed to be getting of God. Now, this also works moving forward. So everything Paul said and Peter said and Timothy said, anything moving forward within Scripture is the same. As we read it, if it's not lining up with what Jesus, the example Jesus gave us, then we need to go back to Jesus and go, wait a second. What is this? And so I love looking at Scripture. I guess I could almost flip that and go, it's really more about Scripture through the lens of Jesus and allowing him to tell us the story, and allowing Scripture to be what it is, which is, when, again, a 30,000 foot view of the whole of the story. And what Jesus did is kind of what we've been talking about, right? He came, he gave us the ultimate illustration and picture of who God is. He also gave us the ultimate illustration of who we are and what we're capable of as humans. And so when you start to pick those things apart and then go, oh, now I can read through. So when we miss the mark in the Old Testament, or when it's off base in the Old Testament, that was us missing the mark. That's not always like, sometimes we make the Old Testament characters like the heroes that we're after, and they're like wildly missing the mark in that book. And Jesus does that. He makes corrections on it.
So now you read my mind a little bit, because you talked about, Jesus through the lens of Scripture, Jesus through the lens of history. And then in my mind, I was like, well, what about, through the lens, using Jesus as your lens, looking at Scripture, and you pointed right at that. So with that in mind, that thought of Jesus becomes the lens of how we view Scripture. How essential is it that we have a clear lens? How essential is it that we understand who Jesus is in order to use him as a filter to understand Scripture?
Yeah, I think that's wildly important, and I tried to focus on that in my message a couple of weeks ago, in the realm of who Jesus is in our picture really depicts who we're following, and if who we're following is going to depict how we live our life, that's pretty wildly important. It's like maybe mission critical, maybe mission like A, start at A. And yet you got a lot of Jesus following people who, I don't know, like I think we're in a moment in our culture who we might say we're Christians, but like, do we know that he was a carpenter? Do we know that he lived in Nazareth and what that means? Do we know that his name was actually Yeshua? Do we know that he spoke Aramaic? or Hebrew. He actually could have spoken Greek, a little bit of Greek as well. But most of his conversations would have been in Hebrew or Aramaic. Like, do we know that? Do we even study that? Do we care about that? Do we know that he wasn't blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus? Like, that he wasn't holding a baby sheep, petting him like with some weird cat woman or cat mom, walking around in pastures reciting scripture. Like, that wasn't the Jesus that we're following. And I think when we start to get into those nuts and bolts and start to unmask some of that, curiosity hopefully takes over and go, okay, wait a second, then who was he really? And I think that's a great place to be. Yeah, right. Who was he really? Let's dive in. Let's think about the fact that, and again, I focus on some of this within my message, but let's think about the fact that let the children come to me. Who wants to run up to, what type of kids want to run up to a boring, mean individual? Like, that doesn't happen. That tells us something about his character. Wow, children wanted to hang out with him. Yeah, that means he was probably really nice. He's really kind. He was probably really fun. He's probably goofy. He had to have some silliness if children are wanting to be around him. How about the fact that it says sinners and tax collectors, that he was basically he's at their parties. Again, I don't know the last time you've seen the overly zealous, religious, priest-like individual get invited to, the house party down the road that are all, hey, grab some Budweisers and meet us over there. Like, people aren't inviting that guy to their party. They're inviting the guys, like, again, that are fun, that are willing to have fun. They're willing to dance. They're willing to enjoy themselves. And they show that they're willing to enjoy themselves. And then somebody's like, oh, hey, like, I got a party going on this Friday night. Would you come? And then they're almost a little bit astonished. He's like, absolutely, I'll be there. And he shows up and I think has some fun. Like, he wasn't some, whitewashed, boring, mean, religious zealot reciting scripture while walking through the prairies and petting sheep. Like, and I think that's, like, even just that right there, I think begins to shift and shape and go, wow, that's wildly different. And if I'm following, because here's where it matters, right? If I'm following a rigid Jesus, then I become a rigid Christian. And if I'm a rigid Christian, children stop coming up to me. Secular, worldly people stop coming up to me. And I ultimately, that trend only continues over and over and over and over until I've lost influence over a lot of people that I was at least meant to have an impact or influence on. All because we followed a Jesus that the picture that was given to us that we just decided to blindly follow instead of actually investing.
All right. So just because we're moving along in time here, let me ask you this. For the guys who are hearing you talk about this, and I would agree with you, having a clear view of who Jesus is a critical component of how we then act or behave as his representatives on earth today. If I'm a guy who's watching this video and it's the first time that my version of the Black Velvet Walmart Jesus painting is being challenged, where do you recommend? Because let's face it, you can go complete nerd on this and read history book after history book that isn't interesting or inviting. Where can I go to just start understanding that there's a not so Americanized view of Jesus that's probably a little more accurate?
Yeah, I think two things. One is Google. I tell my teenagers all the time, like, Google is meant for more than TikTok and whatever you're using it for. So one is Google. Hold on, my son is, hey buddy, give me a second. Okay. He got his walkie-talkie, Spider-Man walkie-talkies out. So, and search some of this stuff. Search for a real picture, like was a real image of Jesus. Some fascinating things will pop up. You can read some articles. Some images will pop up of a Middle Eastern man, which is much more likely. I mean, that's who he was. So, But beyond that, just the characteristics of Jesus, I actually think one tool that we've just recently been given is The Chosen. I don't know if you've watched any of that. I'm not a huge Christian product homer, so I'm not going to throw a bunch of, Christian movies at you and go like, yeah, go watch those. This actually might be the first time ever that I've done that. And I'm not trying to like downplay or whatever. It's just not typically, I don't feel like we really get a good lens very often from those things. But The Chosen is something I've been watching a little bit here. I'm season 2, like episode 4 or 5. And I think they've done a wonderful job at depicting a little bit of everything. They don't strip, I think, the holiness of Jesus. They don't strip that he had a real prayer life. They don't strip him of a relationship with God and the fact that, he was God and man at the same time. They don't strip him of these things, but they also completely put into play the idea of why children would want to hang out with him, why people like there's a scene where he's at a wedding and he's dancing. They're like, he's dancing. Like their minds even are like, this is supposed to be the Messiah. He's a rabbi. He's a teacher and he's out here dancing at our wedding. But he's honoring his as a guest, he's actually honoring the bride and groom even by doing so. And there's a lot of fun. It just shows like the ability for him to walk, to enjoy life, to take everything at its, fullest. And you're talking about a guy who like probably the greatest purpose of anybody who's ever touched feet on earth, and yet takes the time to dance at a wedding, yet takes the time to laugh, takes the time to make fart noises in front of kids so that they giggle, and they depict that in this series really well. And so I would encourage, if you're interested in this or want, I think, a better grasp of maybe who this guy was, you're not going to get the historical context of what everything equaled. But you're going to see a little bit more of the world. And I think a better picture of the characteristics of who he probably more likely was.
That's interesting. And I have watched the show. I'm eagerly awaiting the next season to come out. And honestly, one of the things that I identified in is the character portrayals of everybody and the personalities they give them. But the fact that they let Jesus be a little sarcastic, not cynical, but a little bit, he's got a little jab here and there, and he picks at his disciples. And because let's face it, if we are made in his image, in God's image, and Jesus was fully God and fully man, I have to believe that as much as you and I banter, that Jesus would have done the same. If we can laugh at ourselves and laugh with each other, I just don't understand how it could be that doesn't exist in him as well.
100%. I've always been a big advocate of that. And even in that series, I've loved that about that as well. Even within the religious leaders, there's one point he's in the temple and they say, what is wrong with you? And he's like, apparently everything. And because he's like, if I heal a guy, you yell at me. If I don't heal the guy, you yell at me. So I do this thing and then you're yelling at me. He's like, what's wrong with you? He's like, apparently everything. And you're like, get out. And he doesn't even respond. He's just like, he shrugs his shoulders like, okay. And then walks out. And then we're like, come back here. And he just keeps walking. I love it. I'm like, yeah, that's a real man. That's a real human. And I see that within the tone of scripture, honestly, as well. Like there's moments within scripture where he's giving it, are you still so dull? It's not like a really comforting, really nice moment, he's looking at his disciples. They're asking a question. Well, why? And he's like, are you still so dull? Like, oh, ouch, it's a little hit, but he's there. He's doing life with them. So he has the relational bandwidth to do it. I love it.
All right. Well, hey, Joseph, thank you so much for spending time with us today and just expanding on, thoughts from your message and again, giving us this thought process of where we get our lens for scripture, in the life, in the man, and in the deity of Jesus. So thank you for being here. And, again, guys, if you didn't see Joseph's message, check out the links and go back, watch it. You'll get a lot more context for today.
Great. So, thanks for having me.
Guys, we'll see you again next week here on Drivetime.